Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a time when thunder didn't come from the sky. It came from cannon fire, drums, and the marching boots of a man named Napoleon Bonaparte. You can almost hear the crash of waves against Corsica's jagged shores, smell the brine and smoke of a poor island dreaming of power. This isn't some romantic postcard, it's a hard place. Olive groves, vendettas, and goats bleeding under a sun that doesn't forgive. And right there, in a modest stone house on Ajaccio's crooked street, a restless boy with piercing eyes is already mapping out how to conquer the world. You probably won't survive this one, at least not without rethinking what ambition really means. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. Corsica, London, Saigon, or wherever your screen glows tonight. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The air on Corsica in 1769 tastes of rebellion. France has just seized the island from Genoa, and the locals aren't thrilled about it. You walk through narrow alleys where shouts echo in two languages, Italian and French. In one of these houses, a small child is born to Carlo and Letizia Bonaparte, minor nobles clinging to faded titles. He's named Napoleone di Bonaparte, though he'll later drop the Italian flair for something sharper, more French, more imperial. He's not from wealth, but his mother's willpower alone could bend mountains. Letizia endures wars, famine, and childbirth with the same steel calm she'll later demand from her son. Napoleon grows up surrounded by 8 siblings, learning early to fight for scraps, of bread, of affection, of attention. The family's coat of arms means nothing on an island ruled by French muskets. At 9, you see him sent to the mainland, shy, undersized, speaking a clumsy French laced with Corsican rhythm. His classmates call him the little barbarian. He doesn't forget. Instead, he retreats into books, Plutarch's Lives, Caesar's Commentaries, stories of Alexander. His notebook margins crawl with equations, battle sketches, and tiny kingdoms ruled by imaginary emperors. Historians still argue whether this isolation was a wound or a weapon. Did it harden him into the calculating genius he became, or merely teach him how to hide his loneliness behind discipline? Whatever the answer, it fuels him. Every slight becomes motivation, every insult, ammunition. You catch glimpses of him in the military academy at Brienne, the silent one, always reading, always plotting. He's the kid who turns play battles into full-blown sieges using snow forts and branches as artillery. His teachers note 2 things: excellent at mathematics and has a volcanic temper. That temper, barely leashed, will one day send 100,000 men across Europe. Here's your first quirky tidbit. Napoleon loved the smell of gunpowder. Not metaphorically, he literally said it clears the mind. Imagine that as a candle scent. Ode to Empire. You'd probably buy it just for the irony. Meanwhile, Corsica's revolt flares again, led by the nationalist hero Paoli. The Bonapartes must choose, stay loyal to France or to their homeland. They pick France, barely escaping vengeance. For young Napoleon, it's another fracture. His identity split between 2 flags. When his father dies of stomach cancer, the 16-year-old becomes head of the family. He writes letters dripping with both grief and calculation. He's already balancing tragedy with tactics. At the same time, he's absorbed in Enlightenment philosophy, Rousseau's social contract, Voltaire's biting wit. He imagines a world where merit, not birth, decides a man's fate. But France in the late 1780s is cracking open. Bread prices soar. Riots swarm. The monarchy totters like an overripe fruit. And somewhere in a draughty dorm, a Corsican lieutenant in an ill-fitting uniform senses destiny approaching. You trail him through the narrow streets of Auxonne, where he studies artillery. He's obsessed with geometry and logistics, angles, gun ranges, the physics of power. "Give me a few cannon," he jokes to a friend, and I'll change the world. Everyone laughs. He doesn't. There's an irony the size of a cannonball. The young man who once despised the French crown will soon rise to rule its empire. The transformation begins not in a palace, but amid revolution, when everything old is burning and everything new is up for grabs. At this stage, Napoleon is still half-formed, a brilliant loner shaped by poverty, humiliation, and relentless will. He's got the mind of a mathematician, the heart of a poet, a bad one. His teenage verses are truly awful, and the ego of a small son. But every empire begins as an equation, an impossible sum of hunger and opportunity. So here he stands, a young Tomorrow, he'll march into a France on fire. But tonight, on this quiet island between two worlds, a boy still listens to the wind against his window and dreams, not of comfort, but of conquest. You're standing in the courtyard of Brienne Military Academy, snow crunching underfoot, watching a thin boy in a worn gray coat trace battle lines in the slush with a stick. That boy is you, or at least it feels that way. You're cold, hungry, and sick of the laughter echoing from the dormitory windows. They mock your accent, your manners, your provincial name. You speak French like it's a second language, which, of course, it is. Bonaparte, they sneer, rolling the vowels. You pretend not to care, but each word burns like powder in a musket, waiting for a spark. He studies alone by candlelight, devouring every scrap of military history he can find. Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar. He memorizes their campaigns, not as stories, but as blueprints. The teachers see something uncanny in him, precision beyond his years, calculation that feels cold, almost mechanical. One notes that he reads mathematics as others read novels. Another writes, Napoleon's pride is dangerous. You'd agree. It's the kind of pride that would rather reshape the world than admit defeat. Still, the isolation molds him. He doesn't chase friends, only victory. When the others fence, he writes essays on artillery. When they gossip, he dreams of artillery parks and logistics. Imagination rules the world, he'll one day say. And here, you see where that conviction was born. In solitude, among books and numbers. Historians still argue whether this loneliness made him a genius or a tyrant. Did he crave power because he lacked affection, or because he saw power as the only thing that could quiet his own insecurity? Nobody knows. But what's certain is that this outsider begins to see himself not as a man of Corsica or even of France, but as a creature of destiny. Then comes Paris. You step with him into the École Militaire, where aristocratic sons parade in powdered wigs while Napoleon counts coins to afford dinner. His uniform is neat but patched, his boots second-hand. Yet while others dance at soirees, he maps imaginary battles across his desk. In 1785, he graduates, second lieutenant of artillery, barely 16. The instructors barely notice. You can almost hear his inner voice whisper, they will notice. A few months later, his father's death cuts the family adrift. Young Napoleon becomes provider. He sends every spare coin to his widowed mother and siblings, surviving himself on bread and water. He writes letters filled with despair and ego all at once. I live for honor. I shall one day astonish the world. And you believe him. Not because he's already great, but because you sense the fuse burning. Here's your quirky tidbit. Napoleon's handwriting was so atrocious that his clerks sometimes rewrote entire pages just to make sense of it. Imagine trying to decipher orders that look like tangled violin strings and realizing they decide the fate of armies. Still, somehow, everyone understood him, perhaps because clarity wasn't in the ink, but in the intention. By the late 1780s, France itself is a pressure cooker. Bread prices skyrocket. Crowds chant outside Versailles. The air smells of smoke and revolution. And you, still a young lieutenant in Valence, see opportunity forming like storm clouds. He writes essays defending Corsican autonomy, flirting briefly with politics, even calling for independence. "I shall die for my country," he declares. But by 1793, when revolution devours its own children, he switches allegiance again. The Corsican patriot becomes a French revolutionary. Another fracture sealed with ambition. At 24, stationed in Toulon, you finally get a taste of command. Royalists hold the port, British ships blockade it, and France is desperate. Napoleon proposes a radical artillery plan: capture the high ground, fire down into the harbor, force the enemy fleet to flee. It works. The city falls. He's promoted on the spot to brigadier general. One act of daring, one leap from obscurity to fame. The irony? He's still technically unemployed, a revolutionary officer in a nation that keeps beheading its heroes. But his star has risen. The kid mocked for his accent now commands men twice his age. He even gains a nickname, the Little Corporal. It's affectionate at first, then mythic. There's a scene you can almost see in slow motion. A small figure on a cannon platform, smoke curling around him, his coat singed, his voice carrying over the roar. Fire! Every shot echoes through history. That's when the legend begins. And yet, even now, you can sense the contradictions forming. He writes love letters to a woman named Desiree, dreams of poetry and peace, but sleeps beside loaded pistols. He speaks of liberty, equality, fraternity, then signs orders for mass arrests. The duality will haunt his entire life. Still, for the moment, he's unstoppable. The outsider has become the insider, the man France needs, though it doesn't know it yet. He's learned that power isn't taken all at once. It's accumulated quietly, like the weight of snow before an avalanche. Somewhere in his diary, he scribbles a line that feels prophetic. Great ambition is the passion of a great character. He's not boasting, he's explaining himself, maybe even warning us. Because ambition, unchecked, can illuminate the world or burn it down. And this young Corsican, once humiliated in a French classroom, now commands cannons capable of both. You exhale, watching him stare across the harbor he just conquered. His eyes aren't triumphant, they're restless, calculating the next move, the next victory. For him, peace is merely the pause between battles. You're standing in the choking air of revolutionary France, a place where bread riots and guillotines share the same rhythm. The year is 1793, and Paris feels like it's constantly on the verge of either salvation or self-destruction. You move through the narrow streets, past posters screaming Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, and the smell of fear disguised as patriotism. Heads roll daily at the Place de la Révolution. Even whispers can get you executed. And somewhere in this chaos, a young general named Bonaparte sharpens not just his saber, but his timing. He's still the same Corsican outsider, but now he wears the tricolor cockade with purpose. The revolution, brutal and unrelenting, has opened doors that birth certificates once closed. Aristocrats are out, talent is in, and Napoleon, young, hungry, and ruthless, fits the moment like a cannonball fits its barrel. In the south, at Toulon, he's just proven his brilliance. The Committee of Public Safety takes notice. For once, being noticed in revolutionary France doesn't mean losing your head. He's promoted again, his name whispered with both admiration and suspicion. You can feel his ego swelling, not vanity, but certainty. He writes to his brother, "A man's destiny is his character." Historians still argue whether the revolution created Napoleon or merely discovered him. Was he the product of chaos or its sculptor? Whatever the case, you're watching a symbiosis. He needs the revolution's turmoil to rise, and the revolution needs his discipline to survive. The next year, the script flips. The revolution begins to eat itself. Robespierre's fall in 1794 leaves France dazed, paranoid, and desperate for stability. The guillotine slows, but the hunger for order doesn't. Napoleon is briefly imprisoned for his connections to the fallen Jacobins, Yes, even revolutionaries can be too revolutionary for their own revolution. He's released after 2 weeks, humiliated but alive. Another near miss filed under experience. Then comes Paris, October 1795. The city riots again. Royalists this time trying to overthrow the Directory government. Streets fill with armed mobs. Panic spreads. The government scrambles for a commander to defend them. Someone mutters the name Bonaparte. The rest is legend. You follow him through the smoky boulevards as he orders grape shot to be loaded. Canister rounds meant for battlefields, not city squares. Fire, he commands. The cannons thunder, scattering the insurgents like straw. Hundreds die. The uprising dissolves in minutes. Later, someone coins the phrase, a whiff of grape shot. Napoleon calls it the moment France was saved. It's also the moment he crosses an invisible line, from soldier to political actor. The Directory rewards him with command of the Army of the Interior. Soon after, they send him to lead the Army of Italy, and you can almost feel the electricity in his letters. I go to find either death or glory. Spoiler, death's not his style. Here's your quirky tidbit. When he first inspected his army in 1796, the men were barefoot, starving, and unpaid. They called themselves the Ragged Brigade. Napoleon addressed them like a stage actor, booming, "Soldiers, you are hungry and naked. The government owes you much but can give you nothing. I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world." Basically, he turned a mutinous mob into believers through sheer confidence and a little theatrical flair. And so begins the legend of Napoleon the Commander. His energy is volcanic. He rides through torrential rain, sleeps 2 hours a night, eats when he remembers to. His men adore him because he shares their misery. He's not a distant aristocrat. He's the wiry figure standing in the mud beside them, soaked to the bone, eyes blazing. His talent lies not in size or strength, but in pattern recognition. He reads the battlefield like a chessboard, predicting enemy moves by instinct. At the Battle of Lodi, he personally leads a charge across a bridge under musket fire. Bullets skim his hat. He survives, of course. Afterward, he writes that it was at Lodi he first felt himself to be a man of destiny. You can almost see him on that smoky bridge, wind whipping his hair, cannon fire echoing, a cinematic birth of ego. The victories pile up. Arcole, Rivoli, Mantua. Each name becomes a step on the ladder to myth. France hails him as its savior. The Directory, both proud and terrified, keeps promoting him. You sense déjà vu, how quickly a republic begins to depend on a single man's charisma. But beneath the glory, contradictions multiply. He loathes politics, yet manipulates it effortlessly. He writes love letters to Josephine, his new wife, that swing between poetry and paranoia. "I love you," he writes one day, "but I distrust you." Historians still debate whether Josephine was faithful, but what matters is how her absence makes him work harder. Victory as therapy. Meanwhile, Europe begins to whisper. Austria and Britain see the young general as a threat. His victories reshape alliances, redraw maps, and unnerve kings. But Napoleon doesn't just conquer territory, he conquers imagination. Artists sketch him, pamphlets mythologize him. Children play with toy soldiers shouting, "Vive Bonaparte!" And in Paris, politicians realize the irony. They've built a system meant to destroy monarchs, yet they're feeding one's rise. The revolution's child is growing teeth. By 1797, when he signs the Treaty of Campo Formio, ending the war with Austria, you can feel the power shift. Diplomats twice his age treat him like an equal. Monarchs whisper his name like a curse. He's still not emperor. Not yet. But you can tell it's only a matter of time. The revolution gave him chaos, and he's learned how to shape it. The boy who once couldn't afford boots now commands nations. And as you walk with him through the candlelit halls of Paris that winter, you sense it. France's pulse slowing, listening. The guillotines are quiet. The mobs are gone. For the first time in years, the country feels a strange new sensation. Not fear, not liberty, control. You march beside him now, boots sliding in the mud, the smell of gunpowder hanging in the alpine air. It's 1796, and you're with the army of Italy. Though army might be generous. The men are gaunt, their uniforms threadbare, their muskets older than they are. The pay hasn't arrived in months. Even the mules look mutinous. But standing before them is Napoleon Bonaparte, 26, thin as a bayonet, voice sharp enough to cut marble. He climbs onto a rock, waves his hand and declares, "Soldiers, you are naked, hungry, and ill-fed. I will lead you to the most fertile plains in the world." It sounds insane, but it works. You can feel morale surge through the ranks like a current. They don't follow him because he's noble. They follow him because he looks just as desperate as they do. The campaign begins. You trudge with them through the passes of the Apennines, rain soaking your coat, lightning flashing on the peaks. Napoleon doesn't sleep. He rides, sketches maps, writes dispatches, eats biscuits when he remembers. He studies terrain like scripture, turning geography into weaponry. His strategy is simple but revolutionary. Strike fast, divide the enemy, and never fight on their terms. At Montanati, he outflanks the Austrians before they even realize he's moved. At Millesimo and Dago, he smashes their lines with precision artillery. The French soldiers who once doubted him now shout his name like a chant. Vive Bonaparte! And then comes Lodi. The Austrians guard a bridge across the Adda River, their cannons sweeping the span. Most generals would wait. Napoleon decides to charge. You hear him shout, "Forward, grenadiers! Follow your general!" And he runs across the bridge himself, saber raised, bullets tearing holes through his coat. He makes it to the other side. The Austrians break. The French pour over the bridge like a flood. That night, sitting by a campfire, he confides to one of his aides, "It was at Lodi that I first realized I might become a decisive actor in history." The understatement of the century. Historians still argue whether it was courage or madness that drove him that day. Maybe both. You move onward to Arcole, where he grabs a fallen flag and wades into a swamp under enemy fire just to rally his men. To Rivoli, where he wins against an army twice his size by predicting their every move like a chess master. To Mantua, where he starves out an Austrian garrison after months of siege. Every victory feels inevitable in hindsight, but at the time, they're miracles carved from chaos. Here's your quirky tidbit. Napoleon didn't just plan battles. He planned how those battles would be remembered. After every victory, he dictated bulletins to the Moniteur, France's main newspaper, filled with exaggerated heroics. It wasn't just propaganda, it was branding. He understood that perception was half of power. Even in 1796, he was already building the Napoleon myth. Meanwhile, Paris can't get enough of him. Newspapers call him the man of destiny. Women write him fan letters. One says, "Your sword has freed Italy, but your smile has conquered me." He doesn't even reply, too busy conquering actual countries. The campaign reshapes Europe. The ancient Republic of Venice, proud for 1,000 years, collapses under his terms. He reorganizes northern Italy into sister republics, introduces new laws, and loots priceless art for the Louvre. Critics call it theft. He calls it civilization. The contradiction becomes a pattern. Progress wrapped around plunder. Every night, you see him bent over maps by candlelight, calculating not just troop movements, but ideas. How to spread liberty at the point of a bayonet. He's 27 and already negotiating peace treaties with emperors. The Treaty of Campo Formio in 1797 ends the war with Austria. France gains territory. Napoleon gains immortality. He dictates terms like a monarch, even though, technically, he serves a republic. Diplomats twice his age call him General Bonaparte with a mix of awe and unease. The Directory back in Paris begins to realize their mistake. They've created a star too bright to control. He returns to France a hero. Crowds line the streets, throwing flowers, shouting his name. His carriage disappears under wreaths and banners. It's the triumph of a man who came from nothing. And yet, when you look closely, he seems almost bored. Victory, for him, isn't fulfillment, it's momentum. Historians still debate whether Napoleon's Italian campaign was his peak or merely his prelude. Some say his brilliance lay in mobility and improvisation. Others argue he was just lucky his enemies were slow, but the numbers don't lie. In 1 year, he fought 18 battles and won them all. That's not luck, that's obsession. Back at home, though, the Directory is uneasy. They fear the man they celebrate. Too popular, too ambitious. France doesn't like heroes for long. It prefers martyrs. To keep him busy, and maybe get him killed, they send him east, to Egypt, but that's another story. For now, the army rests, drunk on glory, unaware they've become the instruments of a new empire forming in their midst. You watch Napoleon standing on a balcony in Milan, coat flapping in the wind, staring toward the horizon as if Europe itself were merely the next page in his notebook. The revolution made him possible. Italy made him inevitable. And the world, whether ready or not, is about to meet its first modern conqueror. You're sailing east now, the wind heavy with salt and ambition. France's tricolor flaps above a fleet bound not for Europe, but for legend. It's 1798, and you stand on the deck beside Napoleon Bonaparte as he gazes toward Egypt, eyes narrowed against the sun. Behind him lie the Alps, the applause, and an increasingly paranoid Directory desperate to get him anywhere but Paris. Ahead lies the desert, a place where glory and madness often trade places. Napoleon tells his officers that Egypt is the key to breaking Britain's empire. Strike at its trade route to India, and London will crumble. But there's more to it. He wants mystery, grandeur, something beyond mere victory. We shall find in Egypt the cradle of civilization, he says, and perhaps the secrets of the ancients. You can't tell if he's talking as a conqueror or as a tourist with divine delusions. When the fleet lands at Alexandria, the heat hits like a slap. Sand seeps into everything. Gun barrels, boots, lungs. The locals stare at the pale men in blue coats as if ghosts have washed ashore. The campaign begins with a mirage of triumph, the Battle of the Pyramids. Napoleon lines up his men in perfect squares against the Mamluk cavalry, their sabers flashing like shards of sunlight. From the height of these pyramids, he declares, 40 centuries look down upon you. He wins, of course, his discipline against their chaos. But the words echo louder than the cannon fire. Here's your quirky tidbit. Napoleon brought with him not just soldiers, but scientists, 167 of them. Mathematicians, linguists, botanists, even artists. Their mission? Study Egypt's ancient wonders while the army conquered the modern land. They published Description de l'Egypte, a 20-volume encyclopedia that basically invented Egyptology. So yes, between sieges and sandstorms, they also discovered the Rosetta Stone. Talk about multitasking. But Egypt isn't Italy. There's no lush countryside, no cheering peasants, no easy supply lines. The desert swallows armies whole. The Nile floods unpredictably. The French bake under the sun by day and freeze under the stars at night. Locals rebel constantly. Disease spreads faster than rumor. And then comes Nelson. The British admiral finds Napoleon's fleet anchored in Abu Qir Bay and annihilates it in one night. The Battle of the Nile, a disaster of biblical proportions. Ships explode, the sky burns red, the Mediterranean turns into a grave. Suddenly, the army of the Orient is trapped in the Orient. France might as well be on another planet. Still, Napoleon keeps moving. He marches to Syria, sieges Acre, and fails. One of the few times you'll ever see him retreat. The heat, the plague, the corpses rotting in trenches. It's as if the desert itself mocks him. At Jaffa, French soldiers execute thousands of prisoners to conserve food. The man who once preached liberty now orders massacres. Historians still argue whether this was cold necessity or the moment his idealism truly died. And then there's the plague hospital scene, the one even his enemies admired. Napoleon walks into a quarantine ward full of dying men. Doctors beg him not to enter. He touches the sores of the infected, calmly, almost theatrically, as if daring death to blink first. The gesture becomes famous, painted, and romanticized. Was it bravery or pure propaganda? Either way, it worked. But beneath the heroics, you can sense fatigue setting in. The campaign becomes a mirage of victories that cost too much. Egypt refuses to be tamed. The desert doesn't bend to geometry or genius. And when news arrives that France is collapsing politically, Napoleon decides, quietly, selfishly, to leave his men behind and sail home. That's the thing about him. He always knows when to vanish. While his army sweats and starves in the sand, he slips away aboard a frigate, dodging British patrols and storms. A few months later, he arrives in Paris as if returning from paradise, not failure. He's still a hero. His propaganda bulletins have worked too well. France doesn't see a stranded general. It sees the man who conquered the East. Historians like to call Egypt his laboratory of empire, the place he tested how far myth could travel before truth caught up. You can feel the first crack in his invincibility, but also the birth of something darker, the realization that people will believe whatever image he projects. He begins to see himself not just as a commander, but as destiny's narrator. If reality doesn't match the story, he'll rewrite it. Back in Paris, the Directory totters. Corruption, inflation, paranoia. France is exhausted. And when Napoleon steps off his carriage, the crowds roar like it's a second coming. Nobody cares about the ships lost in Egypt or the thousands buried in the sand. They see only the myth walking in from the horizon. He smiles faintly, knowing the game has changed. The revolution gave him freedom. The army gave him power. But now he wants permanence. He's tasted what it means to command not just men, but belief. And soon, he'll seize the one thing that can turn belief into law: France itself. You wake to the sound of Paris in 1799. Horses clattering over cobblestones, vendors shouting, and the faint tension of a country that's lost its nerve. The revolution has aged badly. The ideals of liberty and equality now share space with food shortages and paranoia. The Directory, the five-man government meant to preserve stability, has become a circus of corruption. France is broke, hungry, and tired of politicians. It needs a savior, and, conveniently, one has just walked in from the desert. Napoleon Bonaparte steps off his carriage with the calm of someone who already knows the ending. He's still tanned from Egypt, thinner, his uniform dusty and simple. But that's exactly how France likes its heroes: unpolished, exotic, and victorious. The crowd swells, cheering his name. They call him the Sword of the Republic. You can't help but notice the irony. Republics usually die by the sword, not praise it. Historians still argue whether the coup of Brumaire, November 9, 1799, was meticulously planned or improvised genius. Either way, you're there as the scene unfolds like theater. Napoleon meets secretly with conspirators, CAS, Talleyrand, and a few others tired of political gridlock. Their plan? Replace the Directory with something stronger. 3 consuls, with Napoleon as the first among equals. Of course, equality isn't really his thing. At dawn, troops loyal to him move quietly through the streets. You walk with him toward the Luxembourg Palace, where the Directory meets. He's calm, expressionless, as if leading an inspection instead of a revolution. By noon, the coup is already halfway done. 2 directors resign, 1 flees, and the rest panic. France, once again, changes government without firing a shot. But the real drama happens the next day at St. Cloud, where the Council of 500, France's legislature, gathers to rubber stamp the transition. It doesn't go as planned. Deputies scream, fists fly, and for once, Napoleon loses his composure. He bursts into the chamber, voice cracking. "Citizens, you are sitting in the midst of dangers. The Republic is perishing." Instead of applause, he gets boos, curses, and one very close attempt at physical assault. He's dragged out, shaken, his face pale. His brother Lucien, quick-witted as ever, saves the day. Standing before the soldiers outside, he points dramatically at the door and shouts, "My brother is defending liberty inside from assassins. Drive them out." The grenadiers storm the hall, bayonets glinting. The deputies scatter. Within minutes, democracy takes its last breath, and France applauds. That's the coup of 18 Brumaire. A revolution inside the revolution. You almost feel sorry for the idealists, still quoting Rousseau. Here's your quirky tidbit. While Napoleon was staging his coup, his mother, Letizia, refused to celebrate. She supposedly muttered, "Well, let's hope this lasts." She'd seen her son's luck too many times to trust it. The new government is called the Consulate, and Napoleon, at just 30 years old, is its first consul, effectively the dictator of France, though he prefers administrator. He moves into the Tuileries Palace, the same building once occupied by the executed king. He orders the royal monogram scraped off the walls and replaced with a simple N. Not yet emperor, but close enough to taste it. And yet, he's not entirely a tyrant. In these early years, his reforms are dazzling. You follow him through candlelit offices, scribbling laws, inspecting blueprints, demanding clarity in everything. He reorganizes the tax system, founds the Bank of France, modernizes education, and creates a new civil code that still shapes much of the world's law today, the Napoleonic Code. That's your mainstream fact for this section. The code made laws rational, secular, and equal, at least for men. It abolished feudal privileges and influenced constitutions from Belgium to Brazil. To this day, France's legal foundation carries his handwriting. Still, power is an aphrodisiac, and Napoleon becomes addicted fast. His schedule is legendary. 4 hours of sleep, endless meetings, meals consumed in 5 minutes. He dictates letters while shaving, reads reports while walking. His secretaries complain they can't keep up. One faints trying. Impossible is a word found only in the dictionary of fools, he reminds them. Classic boss energy. Meanwhile, his relationship with Josephine cools. She's older, charming, and dangerously good at diplomacy, but unfaithful. He, of course, returns the favor with enthusiasm. Their marriage becomes less about love and more about optics, an alliance between myth and influence. Outside, France begins to glow again. Roads repaired, industries revived, order restored. The same people who once cried, "Down with kings," now whisper, "Maybe one wouldn't be so bad if he's competent." Napoleon obliges. He tightens control of the press, censors dissent, and builds an entire state around his work ethic. He studies maps like prayer books, each border a chess square waiting to be rearranged. "Europe is a molehill," he says one night. "All great empires are built on imagination." You realize he's not joking. Still, not everything runs smoothly. The royalists plot assassinations. Republicans seethe in silence. But every threat only strengthens his argument for more authority. "The people need peace," he insists, "and I am peace." You can almost hear the crown jingling in his desk drawer. Historians still debate whether France traded its liberty willingly or was seduced by stability. Either way, it worked. Within a year, Napoleon becomes first consul for life. Within 5, he'll become something even larger, something he once swore never to be. Tonight, though, Paris sleeps. The revolution's fires have cooled to embers, and its hero-turned-architect watches over a city that finally obeys. The boy who once couldn't afford boots now reshapes civilization between two candle flames. You lean closer as he closes his journal. On the last page, one phrase gleams faintly in the light. Power is my mistress. It's a crisp December morning in Paris, 1804. You stand inside Notre Dame Cathedral, the smell of incense heavy in the air. The church glows with gold and candlelight, a setting fit for kings. Except this time, the king is self-made. The choir hums, nobles whisper, and Pope Pius VII sits uneasily on his throne, uncertain whether he's here to bless a man or to witness blasphemy. At the end of the long aisle, Napoleon Bonaparte strides forward in robes of white and crimson, laurel crown gleaming. France's revolution, the one that swore to abolish monarchy forever, is about to crown one. It's the coronation of the century. The orchestra thunders, the banners shimmer, and you feel the collective breath of the crowd. The Pope raises the crown, and Napoleon, without hesitation, turns, takes it from his hands, and places it on his own head. Gasps ripple through the cathedral. Josephine kneels next. He crowns her too. The symbolism is unmistakable. Power granted, not by God, not by Rome, but by will. Historians still argue whether the act was arrogance or genius. Some call it the birth of modern leadership, authority derived from merit, not divine right. Others call it vanity, pure and simple. Either way, the image burns itself into history, a man of the people crowning himself emperor before the church and the world. Here's your quirky tidbit. The painter Jacques-Louis David immortalized this scene in an enormous canvas, but when Napoleon saw the first draft, he demanded one small correction. The Pope, originally painted with his hands folded, was redrawn raising them in blessing. Napoleon didn't rewrite history, he posed it. You follow him out of the cathedral, the air thick with applause and irony. Crowds cheer, bells toll, cannons boom from the Tuileries gardens. Paris glitters that night as if celebrating a new dawn, though you know it's really sunset in disguise. The Republic is dead, replaced by something leaner, faster, hungrier. A monarchy wearing Enlightenment clothes. Still, not everyone minds. The French are tired of instability. They've had 10 years of revolution, famine, and fear. They want glory again. And Napoleon delivers. He reforms everything he touches: law, education, infrastructure, the economy. He founds the Légion d'honneur to reward talent over birth, builds new schools, lycées, and redraws Europe as if rearranging furniture. Roads straighten, bureaucracy tightens, and even the metric system finds its footing. Yet every improvement carries a shadow. The same efficiency that builds schools also builds censorship. The same laws that guarantee equality keep his critics silent. He fills France with spies and informants, turning conversation itself into a dangerous act. To govern is to choose, he says one night, and Napoleon always chooses control. Abroad, he moves even faster. In 1805, the Third Coalition forms. Britain, Austria, Russia, Sweden, all united to stop him. Europe holds its breath. But Napoleon sees patterns where others see threats. He races his army across the Rhine, covering distances that generals call impossible. Within weeks, he traps the Austrians at Ulm. They surrender almost without firing a shot. Then comes Austerlitz, the battle of the three emperors. You can almost feel the frost biting your cheeks, see the mist over the frozen ponds. Napoleon faces the combined forces of Austria and Russia. Outnumbered, outgunned, yet eerily calm. "We shall end the war with one blow," he says. His plan is a masterpiece. Feigned weakness, hidden reserves, perfect timing. When the enemy attacks his weak flank, he counterstrikes through the mist. The Allied army collapses. The sun breaks through the clouds. The sun of Austerlitz, soldiers call it. France exults. Europe kneels. The victory cements his legend. From that day on, the French army is no longer just an army. It's La Grande Armée, a force that moves with mathematical grace. Its structure, logistics, and morale set new military standards. Even his enemies study him. Historians still dissect those campaigns like sacred texts, debating how much was genius and how much was luck. But you notice something deeper in his victories. Each triumph feeds the next hunger. After Austerlitz, he dissolves the Holy Roman Empire. 1,000 years of European order gone, with a signature. German princes bow. Italian republics fall in line. Spain trembles. Only Britain resists. Its navy an iron wall he can't breach. Still, he doesn't stop. He creates puppet kingdoms, crowns his siblings as rulers. Joseph in Naples, Louis in Holland, Jerome in Westphalia. The Bonapartes multiply like royal weeds. Europe becomes a family business. You watch him pacing before a map, moving pins across it like pieces in a cosmic game. Europe is an empire, he muses. France is the heart, and I am France. And somewhere, maybe for the first time, you sense the weight pressing in, the loneliness of absolute command. He eats alone, works through nights, trusts no one fully, not even Josephine. The same fire that lifted him now begins to scorch him. Here's another little curiosity. Napoleon was terrified of cats, absolutely hated them. No one knows why. Perhaps they reminded him that some creatures can't be commanded. Either way, it's fitting. The emperor who ruled millions could not tolerate one disobedient feline. As Paris sleeps beneath a sky streaked with aurora from fireworks, you can't shake the image of that self-crowning hand, steady and deliberate. The boy who once stared out at Corsica's waves has turned ambition into architecture, loneliness into law. And though he doesn't yet know it, the very empire he built so perfectly balanced will soon begin to tip. Slowly at first, then all at once. Because the higher he rises, the thinner the air becomes. You stand on a field blanketed in fog, the smell of sulfur and mud still thick in your nose. The banners of Europe ripple against the cold wind, but only one flag dominates the horizon. Blue, white, and red, carried by men who believe they're invincible. It's 1806, and you march beside La Grande Armée, now swollen to 500,000 men. France doesn't just have an army, it has a machine, and Napoleon is its engineer. Each division moves like clockwork. Corps organized for speed, supply lines mapped to the minute, officers trained to think like generals. He's turned warfare into science. Strategy is the art of using time and space, he says. I am sometimes short of both, but never of courage. You believe him. His soldiers do too. They call him the Little Corporal, not as insult, but devotion. When he rides past, hats lift, throats roar. It's less a cheer than a collective act of faith. Napoleon's victories roll like thunder. Jena, Auerstedt, Eylau, Friedland, each a masterpiece of motion and deception. Against the Prussians, he strikes before they even finish mobilizing. Against the Russians, he fights in blizzards, refusing to retreat an inch. After Friedland in 1807, the Tsar himself sues for peace. You're there as the two emperors, Alexander of Russia and Napoleon of France, meet on a floating raft in the middle of the Niemen River, shaking hands over Europe's carcass. Historians still argue what passed between them that day. Some say mutual admiration, others veiled threats wrapped in courtesy. Napoleon calls Alexander brother, but you can feel the chill underneath. Alliances with him are like bridges made of smoke. They look solid until you step on them. Meanwhile, Paris explodes in celebration. Painters immortalize his triumphs. Musicians compose marches in his honor. Coins bear his profile. Schoolchildren memorize his victories as if scripture. Even his enemies begin to admire him. Goethe calls him the embodiment of the spirit of the age. You can almost see the glint in Napoleon's eyes. He's no longer just a man. He's a myth in real time. But there's a catch. To maintain his power, he must keep winning. And war, like appetite, only grows. Britain remains untouchable across the Channel, its navy undefeated. So Napoleon fights back economically. In 1806, he declares the continental system, forbidding all European nations from trading with Britain. His goal? Starve the British economy by turning the continent into a sealed market under French control. On paper, it's genius. In practice, it's chaos. Smuggling explodes, merchants go bankrupt, and even allies begin to grumble. France's ports stagnate. In Amsterdam, Hamburg, and Lisbon, the blockade breeds resentment instead of unity. You watch as customs officers raid warehouses while the black market booms in plain sight. Britain simply finds new trade routes through India, the Americas, even the Baltic. Napoleon's Europe becomes a cage that punishes itself. Here's your quirky tidbit. Napoleon once personally inspected barrels of British goods smuggled into Paris and ordered them burned in front of a crowd, then secretly kept a few crates of fine English tea for himself. Some addictions are harder to conquer than empires. Still, within the continent, his reforms bloom. Roads improve, universities modernize, and the Napoleonic Code spreads wherever his armies march. In Germany, the Confederation of the Rhine replaces feudal fragments with rational order. In Poland, he rekindles a nation's hope by forming the Duchy of Warsaw. Even opponents admit he's building something remarkable. Yet, beneath it all, you can sense fatigue setting in. An empire too vast to breathe. Josephine, back in Paris, feels it too. She's growing older, childless, and increasingly aware that her husband now sees dynasty as destiny. A throne must have heirs, he tells her coldly. In 1810, he divorces her, tearfully, publicly, and marries Marie-Louise of Austria, the daughter of his former enemy. Politics wrapped in romance, or perhaps the other way around. Within a year, she bears him a son, the King of Rome. Napoleon finally has what he's always wanted, a legacy that won't die with him. Historians still debate whether this was the peak of his power or the beginning of his decline. He controls nearly all of Europe, from Lisbon to Warsaw. Only Britain and Russia remain beyond his grasp. There is only one step from the sublime to the ridiculous, he once joked. He's about to take it. You stand with him in 1811, staring at a massive map of Europe covered in pins and notes. Russia, despite the Treaty of Tilsit, keeps trading with Britain. Napoleon paces like a caged wolf. His marshals warn him, "Sire, the distances are endless, the roads impassable, the winters deadly." He waves them off. "We will be in Moscow in 20 days, he says. It's a phrase that will haunt him forever. But for now, Europe still bends to his will. The streets of Paris glitter, operas sing his praises, statues rise faster than walls can hold them. He's no longer merely Emperor of France, he's master of the continent. His armies move like clockwork, his bureaucracy hums, his legend towers. And yet, when the fanfares fade and he sits alone at his desk, head bowed over letters, candles burning low, you glimpse a shadow across his face. The same restless hunger that once lifted him now gnaws at him. There's nothing left to conquer but peace itself, and peace terrifies him. He whispers, almost to himself, "I have made France great. Now I must make history remember." You know what's coming next. He's about to chase eternity into the snow. The map of Europe lies spread across his desk like a challenge. Red pins mark his victories, blue pins mark his enemies, and somewhere between them, a cold expanse called Russia waits. Vast, silent, impossible. It's spring 1812, and you stand behind Napoleon as he traces the Russian frontier with a gloved finger. His jaw tightens. The Tsar has betrayed the alliance, he murmurs. He trades with Britain. He insults the system. To anyone else, it's a diplomatic dispute. To Napoleon, it's personal. He decides the solution is simple: invade. Never mind that the distance between the Rhine and Moscow is over 2,000 kilometers. or that supply lines will stretch thinner than paper. Logic doesn't interest him anymore, only momentum. His advisors plead caution. "Sire, this is not a war, it is geography." Napoleon just smiles. Geography is conquered by men. You march with him into the east, part of the Grand Armée, nearly 600,000 strong, the largest force Europe has ever seen. French, Polish, Italian, Dutch, German, an entire continent in uniform. The sheer size of it defies comprehension. Drums beat, banners wave, and morale runs high. The soldiers joke that it's not a war, it's a parade to Moscow. But the farther you go, the quieter it gets. The roads dissolve into mud, supplies lag behind. Russian peasants burn their own villages rather than leave food for the invaders. You pass towns reduced to ashes, wells poisoned, fields empty. The Russians don't fight, they retreat, drawing Napoleon deeper into their endless land. Historians still argue whether Tsar Alexander's strategy was genius or desperation. Either way, it works. You keep marching, farther and farther, into silence. By the time you reach Smolensk, the men are starving, horses collapsing from exhaustion. Then comes Borodino. The battle is apocalyptic. Cannons thunder for 12 hours straight. Smoke turns day into twilight. The air vibrates with screams. Napoleon paces restlessly, wrapped in his gray coat, watching the slaughter through his telescope. "What a terrible war," he mutters. And yet, what glory! When it ends, the Russians retreat. But so does victory. More than 70,000 men lie dead or dying. Still, he presses on. In September, you finally see Moscow, on fire. The city is abandoned, torched by its own governor. The emperor rides through empty streets, the air thick with soot and disbelief. He waits for peace talks that never come. The Tsar refuses to negotiate. The Russian winter arrives instead. Here's your quirky tidbit. To keep warm in the Kremlin, Napoleon had his soldiers dismantle furniture to burn for heat, including an ornate throne. "It keeps me warm," he joked, "at least once in its life." Gallows humor from a man watching his empire freeze. The retreat begins in October, and it's worse than any battle. Snow falls like ash, biting wind cuts through uniforms. Frostbite claims fingers, noses, lives. Horses die in droves. Cannons are abandoned. Boots disintegrate. Men march barefoot through ice. You pass corpses frozen mid-stride, faces still twisted in agony. Napoleon tries to maintain control, riding at the front, shouting encouragement, but even he can't defy nature. The army shrinks daily, from 600,000 to 100,000, then 50,000, then less. The Berezina River becomes the final test. Russians close in from both sides. Napoleon orders bridges built from wagons and debris. Thousands drown, trampled or crushed beneath the chaos. Somehow, he crosses, barely. Historians still debate how he survived. Some say sheer luck, others divine irony. What's certain is that the man who entered Russia as the master of Europe leaves it haunted and hollow. When he reaches Paris months later, he's gaunt but composed. "The emperor has returned," the newspapers proclaim, but the tone has changed. The myth has cracked. The once invincible genius is now a mortal man who gambled too far. Europe senses blood in the water. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia unite again. The Sixth Coalition. The wolves circle. Even his old allies turn. He tries to rebuild his army, recruiting teenagers, veterans, anyone who can hold a musket. "They call me the ogre of Europe," he says, half smiling. Perhaps I am. But even ogres don't surrender. And still, there's something tragic in how he carries himself. Gone is the fiery conqueror who led charges across bridges. Now, he's the strategist, trying to save what remains of his dream. Yet even in defeat, his confidence never fully breaks. "Fortune," he writes, "is a woman, and she favors the bold." Here's another odd fact. During the retreat, He carried a small vial of poison sewn into his jacket, his last resort in case of capture. He tried to use it once after returning to Paris, but it had lost potency. He survived, coughing, pale, muttering, "I was not meant for poison." A line both absurd and true. You realize then that his greatest flaw isn't arrogance, it's belief. He believes he can bend the world by sheer will, and perhaps he almost did. But Russia reminds him, and the world, that even the mightiest empire collapses when it marches too far into its own legend. By 1813, Europe's cannons are loaded again. The tide has turned, and the once bright star of the revolution is flickering. You can feel the chill of inevitability, the sense that history, like the Russian winter, is closing in. The boy from Corsica who once defied gravity itself has finally met something colder than ambition. You awaken to the sound of distant cannon fire and church bells, the twin soundtrack of Napoleon's twilight. It's 1813, and Europe is on the march, this time against him. France, exhausted and hollowed, staggers under the weight of 2 decades of war. Once loyal allies, Prussia, Austria, even Bavaria, now join Britain and Russia in a coalition that spans the continent. It's as if all of Europe has decided to collect its debts at once. But Napoleon, ever defiant, refuses to play the role of a man in decline. You ride with him through the mud-soaked fields of Saxony, where he rallies yet another army from the ashes of the last. Many are boys of 16, faces too smooth for war, uniforms too big for their shoulders. He inspects them in silence, then says softly, "You will learn quickly." They cheer anyway, because the emperor's presence still carries a strange gravity, a belief that he can reverse time by simply willing it. At first, he almost does. In the spring of 1813, he wins at Lutzen and Bautzen, outmaneuvering superior numbers with dazzling precision. The old magic seems alive again, until it isn't. His marshals are weary, his horses thin, his supply lines brittle. "I can make plans," he says one night, staring into the campfire, "but I can no longer make soldiers." Historians still argue whether these late victories prove his genius or expose its limits. His tactics remain flawless, but strategy becomes desperate. He's no longer reshaping the continent. He's trying to stop it from reshaping him. Then comes Leipzig, the Battle of Nations. You're there amid the thunder of 500,000 men clashing for 4 relentless days. Smoke veils the fields, and the air tastes of iron and misery. Napoleon fights like a cornered lion, directing charges, rallying broken lines, riding through shot and shell with grim composure. But there's no stopping the tide. Saxon allies defect mid-battle, bridges collapse, the French retreat degenerates into chaos. When it ends, over 90,000 lie dead or captured. Europe exhales. The spell is broken. Here's your quirky tidbit. During the retreat from Leipzig, Napoleon's engineers accidentally blew up a bridge too early, stranding 20,000 men on the wrong side of the river. He wept in rage, not for strategy, but for waste. It's one of the few times witnesses saw him cry openly. After Leipzig, everything unravels. The once invincible Grande Armée limps home through rain and ruin. In Paris, even his ministers whisper of peace. But the emperor still dreams of turning defeat into destiny. One more campaign, he insists. One more. You watch him gather what's left. Conscripts, old veterans, half-equipped regiments, and hurl them into one final defense of France. The 1814 campaign becomes a tragic encore. Napoleon, at his purest, outnumbered but brilliant. In 6 weeks, he wins 6 battles: Brienne, Champaubert, Montmirail, Vauchamps, each a flash of the old lightning. His enemies begin to fear him again. He is everywhere and nowhere, one general writes. It is like fighting a ghost, and yet ghosts can't hold territory. The Allies push relentlessly toward Paris. His marshals, once loyal unto death, now beg him to negotiate. He refuses. Better to fall with honor than live in chains. You realize he still believes he can outthink inevitability. Historians still debate whether his downfall was pride or exhaustion. Maybe both. The same engine that once drove him to greatness can't stop running, even when it's running out of fuel. By March, the coalition armies reach the outskirts of Paris. The city surrenders without him. News arrives at Fontainebleau. Napoleon slumps into a chair, silent. Then quietly, he says, "The game is over." For the first time in his life, he sounds human. He signs his abdication on April 6, 1814. France will keep its throne, but not him. He tries to take his own life with the old vial of poison he'd carried since Russia. It fails again. "The hand of destiny," he murmurs bitterly, "will not let me die." Here's another odd detail. When the Allies debated where to send him, they offered exile on the island of Elba off Italy's coast. Instead of humiliation, Napoleon saw opportunity. "A throne in miniature," he quipped. "Better a small kingdom than none at all." And so, surrounded by foreign guards and fading dignity, he sets sail into exile. France weeps and cheers at once. Crowds line the roads as he departs, some sobbing, others spitting. He passes them with a faint smile, whispering to his aide, "They still love me. They always will." As the ship drifts away from Toulon's harbor, the tricolor flag flaps lazily above the deck. Behind him, Europe breathes again. Ahead of him, the sea stretches toward a small island and, unknowingly, toward one of history's greatest comebacks. The waves slap against the hull like a slow drumbeat. You can almost hear his thoughts. "I have lost everything except myself." You open your eyes to the sound of waves lapping against jagged rocks and gulls crying overhead. The air tastes of salt and exile. It's 1814, and you're standing on the island of Elba, Napoleon Bonaparte's new kingdom. It's barely 20 miles long, a speck of land between Italy and Corsica, small enough to walk across in a day, but just large enough to imprison an idea. France's emperor, conqueror of Europe, now rules over 12,000 fishermen, miners, and goats. When he first steps ashore, dressed in a green coat and feathered bicorn hat, the locals cheer. Napoleon smiles, amused. "Well," he mutters, "at least someone still remembers me." His new realm includes a miniature army, a handful of ships, and a budget that wouldn't fund one of his Paris balls. Yet he throws himself into governance with absurd enthusiasm, building roads, planting gardens, reorganizing the postal service. Historians still argue whether he was trying to prove a point or stave off madness. Some say he found peace in Elba's simplicity. Others see a man performing empire in miniature because he couldn't bear silence. Maybe both. Every morning, you see him inspecting his fleet, 3 battered boats, then returning to his villa to read dispatches from Europe. He's technically free, but his mind roams restlessly. "They think they have buried me," he tells his aide Bertrand. "They have merely covered me with snow." Here's your quirky tidbit. Napoleon personally designed his new flag, a diagonal tricolor of orange and white with 3 golden bees. When locals asked why bees, he smiled. "Because they work." It's hard not to admire the audacity of a man branding exile like a startup. Meanwhile, in France, things fall apart again. Louis XVIII, restored Bourbon king, tries to rewind time to before the revolution. Nobles return, taxes rise, veterans are dismissed, and rumors spread that the monarchy plans to undo the Napoleonic reforms. Across the countryside, people whisper the old name, l'Empereur. In taverns and barracks, soldiers still drink to him in secret. Napoleon listens. Spies, merchants, even fishermen bring him news. Each letter fuels the same thought. France still needs me. You can see it in the way he begins pacing again, calculating distances, tides, loyalties. He times the British guard ships, notes their patrol schedules. sketches escape plans in the margins of his books. His sister Pauline sends money. His loyal soldiers polish their old uniforms. It feels less like exile and more like intermission. Historians call what comes next the most audacious jailbreak in history. On February 26, 1815, disguised as a British officer, Napoleon slips past the guards and sails with 1,000 men aboard the tiny brig Inconstant. As the wind fills the sails, he laughs softly. "They will not expect me. That is why I shall succeed." 6 days later, you see the coastline of France rising through the mist. He lands near Cannes. No army, no allies, just his charisma and reputation. Local officials panic, sending troops to arrest him. But when the soldiers confront him near Grenoble, he rides forward, alone, throws open his coat, and shouts, "If any of you would kill your emperor, here I am." Silence. Then cheers. The soldiers defect instantly. The legend has returned. Within days, France erupts. Every garrison, every veteran, every restless heart flocks to his side. By the time he reaches Lyon, his army has swollen to tens of thousands. In Paris, Louis XVIII flees without a fight. Napoleon enters the capital on March 20th to thunderous applause. It's as if the last year never happened. The newspapers call it the Flight of the Eagle, a name that feels almost prophetic. For a brief moment, France breathes again. The streets glow with torches, music, laughter, belief. The emperor is home. Here's your next curious fact. In those triumphant weeks, Napoleon promised something new. Not endless war, but peace. "I return," he said, "to save France, not to destroy Europe." But you can tell it's a lie he almost believes. His enemies don't. The coalition forms again, determined to crush him once and for all. And so begins the final act, the 100 Days. Napoleon works at a feverish pace. He reinstates the Constitution, reforms taxes, rebuilds the army from veterans who appear as if conjured from thin air. Cannons are rolled from storage, uniforms sewn overnight. "Europe thinks me finished," he says, but Europe miscalculates. Even Josephine, his former wife, sends him her blessings from afar. "You will win," she writes, "or you will die. But either way, you will be Napoleon." Historians still debate whether these 100 days were madness or genius. In truth, they were both. The final flash of a comet burning through the sky, brilliant and doomed. You walk with him through the gardens of the Élysée as twilight deepens. The crowds outside chant his name again. He pauses, eyes distant. "It feels the same," he says quietly, "but it is not the same." And you realize, some part of him already knows. This isn't resurrection, it's reckoning. You can almost hear the drum beats echoing through the mist of northern France. Steady, relentless. Like the ticking of a clock counting down the last moments of an era. It's June 1815, and you're riding with Napoleon again, the air thick with rain and destiny. The 100 days are almost over, though no one yet dares to say it aloud. He's moving fast, as always. 200,000 men summoned almost overnight. Veterans who fought from the Nile to Moscow. Boys who barely know which end of the musket fires. France's fields bloom not with wheat, but with uniforms. "They say Europe marches against me," Napoleon jokes grimly to his marshals. "Then we shall save them the trouble and meet them halfway." His plan is as elegant as ever. Strike the British and Prussians in Belgium before they unite. Beat them separately, then force peace on his terms. He's done it a dozen times before, but this time the stakes aren't territory or treaties, it's survival itself. You march north through villages still loyal enough to wave flags and shout, "Vive l'Empereur!" The veterans grin through the rain, calling him the Little Corporal, the nickname that once meant courage, now tinged with nostalgia. But you sense a strange stillness under it all. The rhythm of his empire is slowing. Historians still argue whether the 1815 campaign was doomed by fate or fatigue. Napoleon is sharp, his instinct as quick as ever, but his generals are old, his horses tired, his luck brittle. He's still brilliant, just not infinite. The morning of June 18th, 1815. Waterloo. The sky opens with cold rain, turning the Belgian fields into sludge. You stand at La Belle Alliance Ridge as the French army lines up in gray dawn, cannons sinking into the mud, drums muffled by wet leather. Across the valley, the British under Wellington dig in behind low ridges and farmhouses, patient, silent. The Prussians, still distant, are marching hard to join them. Napoleon, unfazed, surveys the field through his spyglass. "We'll break them by noon," he says. You almost believe him. He's beaten worse odds before, but the rain delays his artillery, his favorite weapon, until midday. Every hour lost gives Wellington time to brace, Blucher time to arrive. Then it begins. The thunder of cannon, the roar of cavalry, the clash of musket lines. The battlefield becomes a blur of smoke and screams. You watch as French cuirassiers charge uphill into a wall of British squares. Perfect formations bristling with bayonets. Horses rear, riders fall, cannonballs churn the earth. The Imperial Guard, Napoleon's last reserve, waits grimly for the order. At 4 o'clock, the Prussians appear on the horizon, black-coated ghosts advancing through the trees. Napoleon's face hardens. "Too soon," he whispers. He sends reinforcements, but it's like patching a dam with paper. His right flank begins to fold. By evening, the air is thick with powder and disbelief. Napoleon rides among the guard, his voice hoarse, eyes blazing. "The guard will advance," he commands. The guard does not retreat. It's his final gamble, the last heartbeat of empire. You march beside them, the sun setting blood red behind the clouds. The guard advances into a storm of fire. Men fall in rows, flags vanish in smoke. For a moment, it feels as though sheer will might bend fate again. But when the smoke clears, the guard is gone, cut down, surrounded, broken. Someone shouts, "La garde recule!" The guard retreats. The phrase ripples through the ranks like poison. Panic spreads. Columns collapse. Cannons are abandoned. The once invincible army dissolves into chaos. Napoleon watches from horseback, motionless, rain streaking down his face like tears he refuses to shed. "It is finished," he murmurs. Here's your quirky tidbit. Even in defeat, his composure never breaks. When his officers begged him to flee, he turned to one and said, "If I had died at Austerlitz, I'd have died immortal. But no, this is better. Men will talk about this longer." He was right. That night, he rides south through the darkness, his carriage wheels sinking into the mud. France is behind him, burning. Ahead, nothing but exile. Again. Historians still debate what lost him Waterloo. Bad luck? Mud? Poor coordination? Or perhaps something simpler, the weight of his own myth. When everyone expects miracles, even genius looks mortal. He abdicates for the second time on June 22nd, 1815. This time, there's no farewell parade, no fanfare. He writes a single line in his resignation: "I am quitting the throne because the welfare of the country demands it." But you can feel the exhaustion between the words, the sigh of a man who has finally outlived his destiny. He tries to escape to America, to start over as a private citizen. For once, he seems almost sincere, but the British intercept him. "I come," he tells them, "like Themistocles, to sit by the hearth of my enemies." They nod politely, then send him not to America, but to a rock in the middle of the Atlantic, St. Helena. As the ship sails away, Napoleon stands on deck, gazing at the receding French coast. "They wanted me to be ordinary," he says softly, "but I was not born to be ordinary." You realize he's not speaking to anyone in particular. He's speaking to history. The sea is endless now. Nothing but gray horizon and restless wind. You stand beside Napoleon on the deck of the British ship Northumberland as it cuts through the Atlantic, bound for exile. The crew avoids his gaze. They don't know whether to salute or pity him. He's dressed simply in his familiar green coat, the same he wore at Austerlitz, the same he wore at Waterloo. The fabric is worn thin, but the defiance is not. He's no longer the Emperor of France, yet somehow he still feels like one. After months at sea, the ship approaches a jagged speck of rock lost in the southern Atlantic, St. Helena. It's smaller than Elba, more remote than prison, surrounded by cliffs that plunge straight into black surf. "So," he says dryly, "this is my last battlefield." You sense both irony and acceptance. Even the sea can't laugh back. When he steps ashore, the islanders stare in awe. To them, he's not a fallen despot, but a living myth. Yet the British governor, Sir Hudson Lowe, treats him as a dangerous prisoner, not a guest. Napoleon is confined to Longwood House, a damp, wind-battered mansion perched high above the sea. Rain leaks through the ceiling, mold climbs the walls, and the endless wind whistles like a mocking tune. He calls it "my coffin on the open ocean." Historians still argue whether Lowe was cruel or merely dutiful. Perhaps both. He restricts visitors, censors letters, counts spoons. Napoleon, accustomed to ruling continents, now debates over firewood and postage. "They fear me," he tells his companions. "Even in chains, they fear me." His small entourage tries to maintain courtly routine. There's Bertrand, faithful as shadow, Montholon, polite but calculating, and the ever-loyal valet Marchand, who tends to him like a son. They dine at 6, discuss politics, then stroll among the windswept cliffs. Napoleon insists they address him as sire, not vanity, but identity. "If I cease to be emperor," he says, "I cease to be Napoleon." And yet, beneath the rituals, something softens. He reads voraciously. Plutarch again, Shakespeare, Ossian's poetry. He dictates his memoirs, crafting his own legend, sentence by sentence. He rewrites campaigns, replays decisions, edits reality. History, he says, is the version of past events that people have decided to agree upon. You can almost hear the faint smile. Even in exile, he's still editing history. Here's your quirky tidbit. One of his favorite pastimes on St. Helena was gardening. He planted willows and roses around Longwood House, saying he preferred the company of things that didn't talk back. Years later, those same trees would surround his grave. The years blur into one another. The wind never stops. Some nights, he walks the veranda alone, staring out at the horizon where clouds and sea blend into nothing. He talks to himself, to ghosts, to memory. "The English," he muses once, "are shopkeepers. They have defeated me with receipts." But even here, the world can't quite forget him. Travelers bring news from Europe, how his legend is growing again, how soldiers still toast him in secret, how artists romanticize his fall. He chuckles when told that poets call him the fallen titan. "Bah," he says, "they need me as a symbol. Better a legend than a corpse." Historians still debate whether he mellowed in exile or merely learned patience. He shows flashes of warmth with children, even teaches them chess, though he cheats constantly. He talks often of his son, the King of Rome, now living in Vienna under the title Duke of Reichstadt. "He will avenge me," he says softly, though deep down he knows the boy never will. In 1818, his health begins to fade. Stomach pain gnaws at him. Doctors argue over its cause. Ulcer? Cancer? Stress? He grows weaker, but remains dignified. "Death is nothing," he tells Bertrand, "but to live defeated and without glory. That is to die every day." Here's another odd detail. He had a fascination with astronomy. On clear nights, he'd point to the stars and tell his valet, "They do not change." That is power. Imagine it. The man who rearranged empires, now content to study constellations. As the months wear on, he writes a will leaving small fortunes to his servants, tokens to his officers, and one final order, that his heart be buried on the banks of the Seine, among the French people I loved so well. It's spring, 1821. The Atlantic mist hangs heavy. He takes to bed, his face pale, breath shallow. Priests murmur prayers, friends whisper farewells. He dictates his last words between gasps. France, army, head of the army, Josephine, then silence. Napoleon Bonaparte dies on May 5th, 1821, aged 51. Outside, the wind doesn't pause. The sea keeps crashing. History, as always, moves on. And yet, even in that still room on a lonely island, something refuses to fade. Because as you watch the candles flicker and gutter out, you know, his story doesn't end here. Legends don't die. They just change address. The sea swallows him first, as if to reclaim what ambition had stolen. Napoleon's coffin, sealed in tin and mahogany, rests beneath a willow tree at Longwood, surrounded by a few weeping followers and the relentless wind. There's no marble, no monument, only grass, rock, and the sound of surf crashing against cliffs. The British officers stand stiffly by, hats in hand. A simple plaque marks the grave. Here lies, nothing more. They refuse to write Emperor. Years pass. The island grows quiet again, its myth fading into waves and mist. But on the mainland, his ghost refuses to rest. Painters, poets, generals, and dreamers can't stop resurrecting him. The man who once commanded Europe now conquers memory itself. Historians still argue what makes a legend endure. Some say it's tragedy, others say it's timing. With Napoleon, it's both. His story ends not in victory, but in exile. A god reduced to man, a conqueror who finally meets limits even he can't bend. Yet that very fall cements his immortality. You don't remember perfection, you remember struggle. In 1840, nearly 20 years after his death, King Louis Philippe of France petitions Britain to return his remains. It's called Le Retour des Cendres, the return of the ashes. You watch as the French frigate Belle Poule, draped in black and gold, sails to St. Helena. Soldiers in blue uniforms dig carefully beneath the willows. Inside the coffin, his features are still eerily preserved. The same aquiline nose, the same proud chin, as if history itself had refused to decay. When the ship arrives in Paris, the city erupts. Millions line the streets. Veterans weep openly. The Seine glitters beneath winter light as the funeral procession passes. The emperor returning home, not as ruler, but as myth made flesh again. His coffin, draped in purple velvet, rests on a golden carriage pulled by 12 black horses. Church bells toll, cannons boom, and Paris trembles with collective memory. He is buried under the dome of Les Invalides, in a sarcophagus of red porphyry, surrounded by marble victories and eternal flame. You can almost hear his echo beneath the arches. France, army, Josephine. Here's your quirky tidbit. The architect originally designed the tomb so visitors would have to look down into it, forcing even kings to bow before the man who once bowed to no one. That wasn't Napoleon's idea, it was France's apology. But the tomb is only half the story. The other half lives everywhere his ideas touched. His civil code, born in candlelit rooms decades earlier, becomes the backbone of modern law across Europe and beyond. His administrative reforms, merit over birth, secular education, centralized governance, reshape nations from Italy to Japan. Even the way modern armies move, organize, and communicate carries his fingerprint. Historians still debate whether he was a tyrant who betrayed the revolution or its truest child. He crowned himself emperor, but spread meritocracy. He silenced free press, but unleashed education. He waged endless war, but built the peace that followed. Paradox was his native language, and you, standing in that silent dome, feel it. The weight of both greatness and failure pressing like the marble above his tomb. The man who once burned Europe to prove his brilliance now lies perfectly still, and yet, somehow, still commands the world's attention. Outside, tourists shuffle quietly, tracing the golden N embossed on the floor. A guide whispers dates and battles, but you barely hear. You're listening to the silence, the kind that only follows someone who changed everything. Here's another small curiosity. Every May 5th, at precisely the hour of his death, a French guard still places flowers on his tomb. No fanfare, no speech, just ritual. The same gesture repeated for 2 centuries. A quiet nod between past and present. And in that moment, you realize Napoleon won his final campaign not through armies or crowns, but through memory. The kings who defeated him are footnotes. The empires that opposed him are dust. But his name, his impossible, contradictory name, still echoes. You glance one last time at the sarcophagus. The inscription around it reads, "Here lies Napoleon, Emperor of the French, who died on St. Helena." Simple, sufficient, final. Yet you can't help but think of his own words, spoken long before the end. Glory is fleeting, but obscurity is forever. If that's true, then the little corporal from Corsica won the only battle that mattered. You stand once more beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, surrounded by silence. Tourists shuffle softly, cameras clicking. But in your mind, the marble floor gives way to time itself. Back through the smoke of Austerlitz, the snow of Moscow, the wind of Elba. Every echo of drumbeat and hoofstep still lingers here. Napoleon is gone, yet he's everywhere. The world he left behind is not the same one he conquered. The Europe of kings he shattered never truly recovered. It adapted, reluctantly, to his blueprints. Empires copied his methods, generals studied his maneuvers, nations adopted his codes. In classrooms from Paris to Prague, students still memorize his campaigns not as history, but as geometry in motion. And in that way, the man who once ruled through cannon and charisma now rules through memory and design. Historians still argue who he really was. To some, he's a visionary, an Enlightenment mind who dragged feudal Europe into the modern age. To others, he's a megalomaniac who sacrificed millions for vanity. Perhaps he was both, because contradictions are what made him human. And humans, unlike myths, can never be simple. He began as a foreigner, a Corsican child mocked for his accent, spurned by the very country he would later define. He rose through the revolution's chaos, wielding its ideals like a sword. He crowned himself emperor, reshaped nations, and challenged the gods of tradition. But he also silenced liberty when it opposed him, turned justice into calculation, and mistook ambition for destiny. He was Caesar and Prometheus, Alexander and Icarus, all in one body too small for his dreams. Here's your quirky tidbit before the lights dim. In his final years, Napoleon once asked his aide to calculate how many men had died because of him. After a long silence, the aide said, "Perhaps 4 million. Napoleon thought for a moment, then replied, "Bah." A soldier's life is the coin with which nations buy greatness. He wasn't being cruel, just honest in a way only conquerors can be. And yet, he also said, "A true man hates no one." That's the paradox. His violence forged peace. His tyranny birthed equality. His downfall birthed legend. His legacy seeps into everything modern: law, merit, military science, bureaucracy, even the idea that one man, by intellect alone, can redraw the world. His system of education still shapes how millions learn. His roads and administrative divisions still define how France governs itself. The world he envisioned, one ruled by reason, not birthright, survived him, though stripped of its imperial edges. In the centuries since, writers have tried to capture him. Tolstoy painted him as destiny's puppet. Hugo saw him as lightning made flesh. Beethoven composed for him, then tore the dedication away in disgust. Each generation remakes him to suit its conscience, Because Napoleon, more than anyone, embodies the eternal question: can greatness exist without destruction? You wander toward the center of the tomb, light falling softly from the dome above. The sarcophagus glows red gold in the filtered sun, surrounded by marble goddesses carved to represent victory, courage, and wisdom. He lies not beneath France, but within it, buried in its heart like a restless thought. You remember how it all began. The boy staring out at Corsica's coastline, dreaming of glory. And you realize it was never about crowns or palaces or maps. It was about motion. He simply couldn't stand still, not even in history. Historians still argue where he fits in the pantheon: hero or tyrant, genius or madman. But that's the trick, isn't it? Every generation must decide for itself, because Napoleon belongs to no one and everyone. He is ambition personified, its brilliance, its blindness, its beauty, and its cost. You step back, letting the echoes settle. The marvel feels cool beneath your hand, the air heavy with centuries of awe. And you think of his own words, scribbled once in exile: "If I were to write my story, I would astonish the world." He didn't need to. The world has been telling it ever since. So now, as the music fades and the night deepens, let's slow everything down. The cannons are silent, the flags folded, the echoes dimmed to memory. You breathe in the quiet, and for a moment, even history seems to rest. Imagine the sea again, endless, gentle now. Somewhere beyond it, a small island lies under stars, and beneath those stars, a man once dreamed of ruling the world. The dream is long over, but the starlight remains. It always does. Close your eyes. You can still hear the rustle of parchment, the scratch of a quill, the clink of a soldier's metal, the murmur of wind across the Seine. The empire's gone, but its shape lingers. In laws, in language, in the way ambition still whispers to every restless heart. Maybe that's why Napoleon endures. Not because he conquered, but because he reminds us how far a single will can reach before it breaks. He was proof that humans are both magnificent and flawed beyond repair, that our hunger to rise is matched only by our capacity to fall. And that, perhaps, is the most human story of all. Now, dim the screen. Let the last echoes drift into sleep and carry with you just one thought. Greatness, like the tide, always returns, but it never stays. Sweet dreams.